Welcome to the First Hebrew Primer, Chapter 12. Let's go ahead and dive into our vocabulary together. Now, there's some good news with the vocab for this week because, two things. One is they're all verbs. And secondly, a number of these verbs you've had before. So a lot of these words are actually already reviewed for you. Let's just walk through them real quickly. So akal is the verb to eat, akal. Amar, which you already know, is the verb to say or speak. Halak, another word, really common word in Hebrew you already know, means to walk or go. Zakar means to remember. Make sure you remember this word because it's kind of ironic when you get it wrong on a quiz. Zakar, to remember. Yada means to know. Yada. Yashav is to sit. Katav, we just had in the previous lecture, is the word to write. Lakach is the verb to take. Malach is the verb rule, to rule. Matzah, to find. Patach is to open. Kara is to call or proclaim. Shalach is to send. Shama is to hear or listen. And shamar is to guard. So it's good news to have some review words for the vocab. And it's helpful because this lesson, on the one hand, is really pretty simple, but it takes a lot of practice to be able to figure out how to do this well. So really, this whole lesson is on irregular imperfects, or what a particular type of irregular imperfects called drop letter imperfects. So what do I mean by drop letter imperfects? There are some roots of the triconsonantal roots. There's some roots that when they're inflected in the perfect, sometimes their first root consonant drops out, and it's called a drop letter imperfect. So for example, first yod verbs like yada, I call it first yod because the first root letter is a yod. In the imperfect, that first yod disappears, it drops, and you're left with dalet ayin as the root. Or lakach, that's a first lamed root. There are a number of first lamed roots that when they're inflected as an imperfect, they lose the first lamed. Yashav, similar thing here. Get another first yod root, you lose it. It's sheen bait are the only two roots that are left, and the same with halak. So, how do you recognize these, or what's the dynamic here? Let's go ahead and take a look. Couple of things, right? These seem really unusual. The verbs that this affects the most are verbs that begin with a yod, hey, lamed, nun, vav. These are the verbal roots that can all lose their first letter in the imperfect tense. So how do you identify drop letter imperfects? Well, know the roots well enough, the vocabulary roots well enough to recognize it even when there's only two root letters left. You have to really be, attentive to those vocabulary. And when you have just the last two root letters, being able to recognize the root is a really valuable skill. And I can't emphasize that enough. Memorizing your vocab, really knowing it well, is a really important skill to have down. Secondly, remember that the signal letters of the imperfect always stay the same. So know your yiktol poem from the last chapter. If you know that yiktol, tiktol, tiktol, tiktali, ektol, yiktalu, tiktolna, tiktalu, tiktolna, niktol. If you know that and you know what the signal letters are, those are always going to stay the same in the imperfect. You know them, and then what you can do is peel those off and look at what root consonants are left. And if there's only two left, knowing your roots well enough, your vocab well enough, can help get you to the meaning of the word. So here's some paradigms that we have here. And on the right-hand side, this is just the person, gender, number. I've organized it third masculine singular, third feminine singular. So you have who, he, ata, second masculine singular, at, second feminine singular, first common singular, third masculine plural, third feminine plural. So I've organized it the same way the yiktol poem is here. And then we have four different drop letter imperfect roots here. I want to just highlight a couple of things with this chart, and it might be worth taking a screenshot of this and spending some time studying it. There's something very similar to this in your textbook as well. Let's take a look all the way on the left-hand side, the verb yada, to know. You'll notice as it's inflected, the signal letters are there, the yod, the tav, the aleph, and so on. But there's only two root consonants left, just the dalet ayin. dalet, ayin. Now, the first one, it looks like all three root consonants are there, but that's really not true. It's the yod, the first yod here is the signal letter of the third masculine singular imperfect. One little trick here is if you see a tsere, that long I-class vowel, tsere, if you see that under a signal letter, that is a sign that it's a first yod root. That tells you it's a first yod root. So you can actually see the same thing with yashav over here. See the tsere under the signal letter instead of the normal hirik? That tells you it's a first yod root. This is from the root yashav. Teshev is from yashav. Now, you'll notice halak. Now, halak is one of the most common verbs in Hebrew, and it acts like a first yod verb. So even though it's technically first hey verb, it acts like a first yod verb whenever it's inflected. So you actually get the same thing with a tsere here in the imperfect. Almost every other time you see a tsere as the vowel under a signal letter, it's going to be a first yod verb, with the exception of halak, because it acts like a first yod verb. So that's helpful. Now you still have the lamed kaf from halak. So that's knowing that, being able to recognize the root from that's really important. Now this other one over here from lakach, this actually acts just like first noon roots will do the same thing. So think of first lamed, first noon, they'll follow the same paradigm. And what happens is the lamed doesn't just disappear. It kind of balls itself up and hides as the dot, as a dagesh forte in the next root consonant. This is called assimilation. So it's yikach is how you pronounce that. Remember the dagesh forte, or that dot there, means there's really two kofs there. And what's happened is the lamed has started to be pronounced just like the kof. And instead of writing the lamed, it's sort of just, like I said, curls up and hides as that dagesh forte, the dot, in one of the two root consonants. So if you see an imperfect, and it's got just a dot, there's only two root consonants left, and it's got the dagesh forte or the dot in the first one, it's a good indication it's either a first noon root or a first lamed root. And you can see that all the way through here. So being attentive to that kind of thing, noticing some of those details is going to help you be able to recognize these roots. Now, some root letters are what the textbook calls partial drop root imperfects. The verbs amar and akal, first aleph verbs, also drop a letter, but only in one form, in the first common singular. And there are also with these first aleph verbs, not all first aleph verbs, but there's about 5 or 6 of them, that have some really unusual vowel combinations as well. And of course, these are very common verbs also. So here's some examples. Take a look at amar, which, as I've said, is one of the most common verbs in the Hebrew Bible to say or speak. Notice how unusual this first form is. It's omar. It's got a holem vowel instead of the normal hirik. Why is that? Well, it's irregular. So it's helpful just to embrace that irregularity. There is a story you can tell as to why this form grammatically ends up like this. In pre-biblical Hebrew, alephs, there were different alephs that represented different vowels than one underneath it. This could be remnants of that. You don't have to know any of that, but just know it's an irregular verb. Same thing with akal. It's okal. It's got a holem vowel there instead of the normal aleph, or the normal hirik. So get used to seeing that. The other thing that is strange, or where they drop a letter, is in the first common singular. Remember, the first common singular, the signal letter is an aleph. So literally, this should be aleph, aleph, mem, resh, but the two alephs next to each other just sort of merge into one, which is why it drops a letter there in the first common singular. Okay, now you may be a little overwhelmed here, and it does, let me just say, it does take practice and patience to be able to recognize drop letter imperfects well. So how do you do it? Well, when you run across a verb, the first thing you want to look at is the signal letters. That's going to tell you it's an imperfect. And you also know a signal letter is not a part of the root of the word, so you can kind of peel that off. So here we have several examples. You have teshavi. Oh, I know that the tav is a signal letter of the imperfect. That's not going to be a root letter. The noon is a first common singular or first common plural root letter, signal letter of the imperfect. So I kind of peel that off. I'm left with kof chet, and so on through here. Then you want to look for the imperfect tense signal letters at the end of the word, if there are any, and you peel those off. Now, in these examples, there's only 2 of them that have one at the ending. Here, the shurik and the hirik yod. And then once you peel those off, you're left with just the 2 root letters. So in the first example, you have shin beit. Like, okay, do I know any roots that have shin beit? The other thing, and your textbook doesn't really talk about this, but if you see a tsere under that signal letter, that tells you it's a first yod verb. So I'd be, that's from yashav, yod shin beit. You have nakach here. We've taken off the noon. We know that's not a signal letter. We're left with kof chet. Like, I see that dot, the dagesh forte there too. That tells me it's either first lamed or first noon. Do I know any roots that have a kof chet that start with either a lamed or a noon? Oh, right, lakach, to take. I know that. So then it's from lakach. Here with halak, again, you've peeled off the first yod, you peeled off the shurik, you're left with lamed kaf. And you're like, the tsere tells me it's a first yod verb, yod lamed kaf. That doesn't seem right. I don't know any roots like that. Do I know any roots like lamed kaf? It's from halak. First hey verbs act like first yod verbs when they're inflected. Here yada, same thing. You're left with dalet ayin. You have tsere, tells you it's from yada. So that's kind of the process mentally you go through, trying to figure out how best to translate these. As you read Hebrew more regularly, the commons ones you'll just start to recognize. And then you'll hardly even notice that they're irregular. They'll just become a part of your working reading comprehension of Hebrew. And you will get a chance to practice this a lot in your homework today, or this week. Okay, when the first letter of a root, this is a caution, something to be careful of. When the first letter of a verbal root is either a nun, yod, tav, or aleph, it can be confusing because those letters are also signal letters of the imperfect. So that in those cases, it can kind of be hard to decide. Is that letter part of the verb root, or is it a signal letter of the imperfect tense? And that can cause some confusion between certain forms of the perfect and imperfect tense as well. So for example, this first one here, yeda, you're like, I know yada means to know. There's only 3 letters. Maybe that's the perfect form. And he knew. Well, the problem there is the vowel pointing's not right? The perfect is yada. It's got the kametz patak, long A, short A. That's the perfect third masculine singular. See, the vowels aren't the same. And that should be the signal that, this isn't a perfect. Maybe that's a signal letter of the imperfect. And that yod is not actually part of the root. It's the third masculine singular signal letter. Similarly, yeshavu, that looks like it potentially could be a third common plural perfect, right? Yashavu. The only difference between these 2 forms is the vowel under the first letter, a tsere or a kametz, the long A. The long A, if you remember back when we first introduced the perfect conjugation, that's a marker of the pa'al or the kal stem perfect conjugation. So the tsere there should be a marker for you that, this isn't a perfect. This must be one of the signal letters. Similarly with amar, that's the perfect of to say, versus omar, that's the imperfect, where the aleph signal letter has merged with the aleph of the root in this particular case. So being able to recognize those things. This is one of the trickier parts of the imperfect. Okay, so in general, how do you distinguish a perfect from an imperfect? Well, really the signal letters are what tell you. If the signal letter is at the beginning of a root, it has to be an imperfect. If the signal letter only appears at the end of a root, it has to be a perfect. If there's nothing on the front and there's only something on the end, it's a perfect versus an imperfect. So again, my advice is be patient for yourself. This is one of the more difficult parts of learning Hebrew, is being able to recognize these weak, imperfect verbs, drop letter imperfects. And as I said, you'll get lots of practice with it in your homework this week.